The first thing Elijah Carter did every morning was check the heat. Not the coffee. Not the bills stacked beside the microwave. The heat. Winters in Ashbury County had a way of slipping through cracked windows and thin apartment walls like they owned the place. And when you had a 7-year-old son asleep in the next room, cold became personal. Elijah stood barefoot beside the old radiator, one large hand resting against the rusted metal while steam hissed weakly through the pipes. Still working. Barely. He nodded once to himself, then pulled on his faded work jacket. The jacket smelled faintly of motor oil and cedar soap. His son used to joke that Dad smelled like garage and pancakes. These days, the apartment only smelled like coffee gone cold and laundry detergent that had been stretched too far. Across the hall, little Isaiah shuffled out rubbing his eyes, dragging a dinosaur backpack behind him. "You leave early today?" Elijah glanced at the clock above the stove. 5:12 a.m. Big repair job, he said quietly. Mansion up on Hollow Creek. Isaiah stopped. Rich people. Elijah smiled without humor. Usually. The boy nodded like he understood more than children should. That happened a lot when a kid was raised by one parent doing the work of two. 20 minutes later, Elijah's old Ford pickup rattled through the gray dawn, windshield streaked with freezing rain. His toolbox slid softly against the passenger seat every time he turned. The truck heater only worked when it felt generous. Today wasn't one of those days. But Elijah still reached over at every red light to adjust the blanket around Isaiah in the back seat before dropping him at school. Small habits. Quiet love. The kind nobody applauded. By 7:04 a.m., Elijah pulled through the iron gates of the Sinclair estate. Even in winter, the place looked untouchable. Long stone driveway. Black SUVs lined near the entrance. Men in tailored coats speaking in low urgent voices. The mansion itself stood against the cloudy sky like something built to survive generations. But grief had a way of making even beautiful places feel hollow. Elijah stepped out of the truck slowly, boots crunching against wet gravel. His hands were already rough from years of labor, knuckles scarred from engines, frozen pipes, broken furnaces, overtime shifts nobody else wanted. A security guard looked him over once before speaking into an earpiece. "Maintenance is here." Maintenance. Not Elijah. Never Elijah. He was used to that. Inside, the mansion smelled like expensive flowers and untouched food. Somewhere deeper in the house, soft piano music played through hidden speakers, too elegant for the heaviness hanging in the air. Staff members moved carefully, whispering around guests dressed in black. Eleanor Sinclair's funeral had ended less than an hour earlier. Elijah kept his eyes low as he followed the house manager toward the West Wing boiler room. "Fix it fast," the woman muttered without looking at him. "The lawyers are still here." He simply nodded. But halfway down the marble hallway, something made him stop. 3 little girls sat together near the grand staircase. Silent. Perfectly still. The oldest looked maybe 12, posture stiff like she'd already decided crying in public was dangerous. The middle child stared blankly at the floor holding a white ribbon in her lap. And the youngest watched every adult in the room with the cautious eyes of a child learning that people leave. Elijah recognized that look immediately. It was the same look Isaiah had after his mother died. One of the attorneys brushed past the girls without slowing down. Another woman leaned toward a man and whispered, "None of the relatives want custody." Too complicated. Elijah kept walking. Because that wasn't his business. Because men like him fixed boilers and drove home quietly afterward. But then he heard the smallest voice. "Are you leaving too?" He turned. The little girl was staring directly at him now. Grace Sinclair. Though Elijah didn't know her name yet. Her small hands clutched the sleeve of an oversized black sweater. Something inside him tightened. The hallway grew strangely quiet. Even the house manager paused. Elijah looked down at the child for a long moment before answering carefully. Not until the heat comes back on. For the first time all morning, the girl nodded slightly. Not smiling. Just, less afraid. And across the room, Charlotte Sinclair, the oldest sister, watched him with guarded eyes. Suspicious. Protective. Like she was already preparing to hate anyone who got too close. Before we go deeper into what Elijah discovered inside that house that day, tell us where you're watching from and do not forget to subscribe, because what happened next changed the way that entire town looked at him. 40 minutes later, Elijah finally reached the basement boiler room beneath the mansion. The pipes were old. Older than the house manager claimed. He crouched beside the furnace, grease staining his fingers as fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Something felt wrong. Then he noticed it. Tucked behind the water heater sat a small pink backpack covered in fading stars. A child's backpack. Hidden carefully like someone had been sneaking down there alone. Elijah frowned slightly and unzipped it just enough to see a folded drawing inside. Crayon lines. 4 stick figures holding hands. 3 little girls, and a tall black man standing beside them. He stared at the picture in silence. Because at the bottom, written in shaky handwriting, were words that made his chest go completely still. I hope he comes back. Elijah stared at the drawing longer than he should have. The basement hummed softly around him, old pipes rattling behind concrete walls while water dripped somewhere in the distance with slow, uneven rhythm. But all he could focus on were the crayon figures. 3 little girls. 1 tall man drawn in dark brown marker beside them. The child who made it had even added work boots and a square toolbox near his feet. Elijah exhaled quietly through his nose and folded the paper with careful hands before sliding it back into the backpack exactly the way he found it. Something about it sat heavy in his chest. Not because children drew strangers all the time. But because lonely children only drew people they hoped would stay. Upstairs, voices echoed faintly through the mansion. Lawyers. Relatives. Money people. The kind who wore grief like an expensive coat they planned to return later. Elijah tightened a valve on the boiler system and listened to the furnace kick alive again with a low mechanical groan. Heat would return to the house in a few minutes. He wiped his hands slowly with an old rag from his back pocket, grease streaking across fabric already stained by years of work. Then he heard footsteps above him. Fast ones. Small ones. He turned just as Grace appeared at the basement doorway clutching the railing with both hands. Her oversized sweater nearly swallowed her whole. You fixed it? She asked softly. Elijah nodded once. Heat should be back soon. The little girl looked relieved for exactly 1 second before her expression closed again. Children who lost too much learned quickly not to trust comfort. She stepped down 1 stair at a time, cautious but curious. Everybody keeps leaving, she whispered. Elijah glanced toward the ceiling, toward the world upstairs with its marble floors and polished shoes. He understood more than she realized. Sometimes grown folks get busy when they do not know what to do with pain, he said carefully. Grace frowned like she was trying to decide if adults deserved defending. Then her eyes drifted toward the backpack behind the water heater. Elijah noticed immediately. So did she. Her small shoulders stiffened. You opened it? She asked. Not angry. Just scared. Elijah shook his head slightly. Only enough to know it belonged to somebody important. She stared at him for another moment before quietly climbing down the last step. That is our hiding spot, she said. Mine and Amelia's. Her voice lowered even further. Charlotte says upstairs is where people pretend. Elijah did not answer right away. Because the thing was. Charlotte was probably not wrong. The mansion felt colder now despite the heat returning through the vents. Too many polished smiles. Too many conversations stopping when children entered the room. Grace crouched beside the backpack and hugged it to her chest. Mom used to come down here when she wanted quiet, she admitted. She said nobody important ever looks in basements. Elijah looked away for a second after that. Toward the old pipes. Toward the shadows. Toward anything except the child standing there trying to sound brave. He had heard sentences like that before from people with money. Loneliness sounded the same no matter how expensive the house was. Then another voice cut through the silence. Grace. Sharp. Controlled. Elijah looked up. Charlotte Sinclair stood at the doorway now, posture stiff, blue eyes guarded beneath tear-swollen lids. 12 years old and already carrying herself like somebody preparing for battle. Behind her stood a woman in an ivory pantsuit holding a leather folder against her chest. Elegant. Polished. Beautiful in the cold restrained way magazine covers liked to photograph. Vanessa Holloway. Eleanor Sinclair's younger sister. Elijah could tell immediately from the resemblance around the eyes. Vanessa looked at Elijah first. Not the boiler. Not the basement. Him. Her gaze paused briefly on his stained jacket and worn boots before shifting back to the girls. There you are, she said tightly. The attorneys are waiting upstairs. Charlotte moved protectively closer to her sisters without taking her eyes off Elijah. Vanessa noticed that too. Something unreadable flickered across her face. Not fear exactly. More like discomfort. Like seeing a piece of the world sitting somewhere she believed it did not belong. Then her eyes landed on the drawing peeking slightly from Grace's backpack. Her expression changed instantly. She stepped forward. Where did you get that? Grace pulled the backpack tighter. It is mine. Vanessa stared at the crayon drawing as if she had seen a ghost. And for the first time since entering that mansion, Elijah realized something else was happening beneath the surface of the Sinclair family grief. Something nobody upstairs was talking about. Vanessa Holloway reached for the drawing too quickly. Not violently. Just instinctively. Like someone trying to hide a memory before it escaped into the open air. Grace stepped back at once, clutching the backpack tighter against her chest while Amelia appeared beside her sister without making a sound. The middle child had been so quiet Elijah almost forgot she was there sometimes. But now her small hand slipped into Grace's sleeve protectively. Charlotte remained between Elijah and the girls, chin lifted, shoulders tense. 12 years old and already exhausted from reading adults. Vanessa noticed the way the children leaned toward the maintenance worker instead of toward family. That realization landed harder than she expected. It is only a drawing, she said carefully, smoothing tension from her voice. You should not be hiding in basements during a funeral. Charlotte's eyes sharpened immediately. Nobody was looking for us upstairs. Silence followed that. Heavy silence. The kind wealthy families learn to decorate over with polished manners and expensive lighting. Vanessa inhaled slowly through her nose. Elijah watched her carefully now. She carried herself like a woman used to controlling rooms without raising her voice. Her blonde hair remained perfectly pinned despite the long day, and even standing beside old pipes and concrete walls, she somehow looked like she belonged beneath crystal chandeliers instead. But grief had started showing around the edges. Tiny cracks near her eyes. A tightness around her mouth. She looked tired in the way rich people often tried to hide. The lawyers are discussing arrangements, Vanessa said at last. You girls need to come upstairs. Charlotte did not move. Arrangements for us? She asked. Vanessa hesitated half a second too long. Elijah noticed. So did Charlotte. The girl's expression hardened instantly. See, she whispered toward her sisters. I told you. Grace lowered her face against the backpack while Amelia stared silently at the floor. Elijah shifted uncomfortably beside the boiler. He should not have been standing there listening to this. Men like him repaired heating systems and left through side doors before family conversations began. But something about the girls rooted him in place. Maybe because he recognized the sound of children trying not to feel unwanted. He had heard it once in his own apartment after Isaiah asked whether his mother would forget him in heaven. Some question stayed with a man forever. Vanessa finally looked toward Elijah again. "Thank you for fixing the heat, Mr. Carter," he answered quietly. "Elijah Carter." She nodded once. Professional. Distant. Yet her eyes lingered on him a moment longer than before. Maybe because the girls looked calmer standing near him. Maybe because the basement suddenly felt less cold. Or maybe because Eleanor Sinclair had once spoken about people like Elijah in ways Vanessa never fully understood until now. "You can leave your invoice with the front office," she said. Elijah gave a small nod and reached for his toolbox. But before he could lift it, Grace spoke again. "Are you coming back?" Vanessa blinked. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly like she already knew how embarrassing hope could become. Elijah looked down at the little girl carefully. There it was again. That same fear. People leaving. Doors closing. Silence after footsteps disappeared. He chose his words slowly. "If the furnace breaks again, somebody will call." Grace considered that answer with heartbreaking seriousness before nodding softly to herself. It was enough for now. Upstairs, the sound of arguing suddenly echoed faintly through the mansion floorboards. Sharp voices. Fast footsteps. Vanessa's expression tightened immediately. Something was unraveling upstairs faster than she could contain it. Charlotte heard it too. "They are fighting about the company again," she muttered bitterly. Not sad anymore. Angry. Too angry for a child. Vanessa straightened at once. "Charlotte." But the girl only turned toward Elijah for one brief second before following her sisters upstairs. And in that single glance, Elijah saw something unexpected beneath all the hostility. Not hatred. Not arrogance. Fear. Pure fear. The kind children carried when they realized adults were making decisions about their lives in rooms they were not allowed to enter. A minute later the basement fell quiet again. Only the boiler hummed softly beside him. Elijah picked up his toolbox and started toward the stairs. Then he noticed something sticking halfway beneath the workbench near the wall. A folded envelope. Cream-colored. Expensive paper. His name was written across the front in elegant handwriting he had never seen before. Elijah Carter. He stopped breathing for a second. Because beneath his name were 4 words written smaller underneath. "For when they need you." Elijah stood alone in the basement staring at the envelope while the furnace rumbled softly behind him. Water ticked through old pipes overhead, steady now, warm air finally pushing back against the winter cold crawling through the mansion walls. But his hands stayed still around the cream-colored paper. He read the words again. "For when they need you." The handwriting was elegant. Controlled. Deliberate. The kind written by someone who had spent a lifetime signing contracts worth more money than Elijah would ever see. Something about it unsettled him. Slowly, he opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet and a photograph. Elijah looked at the photograph first. 3 little girls sitting on a picnic blanket beneath a huge oak tree somewhere during summer. Charlotte looked younger there, smiling wide without caution in her eyes yet. Amelia held melting ice cream in both hands. Grace sat laughing beside a woman with pale blonde hair and striking features, Eleanor Sinclair. Even in a simple white sundress, she carried the same polished elegance Vanessa had worn upstairs. But unlike Vanessa, Eleanor's smile looked real. Warm. Unprotected. Elijah studied the image quietly before unfolding the letter. "Mr. Carter, if you are reading this, then something has gone wrong much sooner than I prayed it would." Elijah frowned slightly. The furnace hummed louder for a moment as if the house itself had taken a breath. I do not know you personally, though I believe good people reveal themselves long before introductions do. I saw the way you spoke to my youngest daughter last winter when you repaired the school heating system during the storm. Most adults spoke around children. You spoke to her like she mattered. Elijah blinked slowly. He remembered that storm. Barely. Grace had been sitting alone near the elementary school gym wrapped in a huge coat while teachers panicked over frozen pipes. He had handed her hot chocolate from the teacher's lounge because she looked cold. That was all. He kept reading. My daughters have spent their lives surrounded by wealth, but not enough safety. If circumstances ever place them in the hands of people who see them as burdens instead of children, I need someone nearby who understands the difference. Elijah's jaw tightened. Upstairs, muffled arguing echoed faintly again through the vents. Sharper now. Faster. He continued reading. You are probably wondering why I would trust a stranger. The truth is, I trust patterns. Quiet kindness. Steady men. The ones who fix things without needing applause afterward. Elijah lowered the letter slightly after that. Something deep in his chest shifted uncomfortably. Nobody had described him that way before. Most days he was just the black man hauling tools through side entrances while people forgot his name the second the heat came back on. He looked back at the final lines. There is a key attached beneath this letter. If the girls ever need somewhere to breathe, take them to the lake house on Briar Road. No staff knows about it. No relatives have access. Only Vanessa. And now you. Elijah unfolded the paper completely. A small brass key slipped into his palm. Old. Heavy. Real. His heart slowed strangely. Upstairs, footsteps pounded across the hallway overhead. Then a child cried out. Not hurt. Just frightened. Elijah looked toward the basement ceiling instinctively. He should leave. None of this belonged to him. Not the letter. Not the Sinclair family. Certainly not whatever war was beginning upstairs behind polished doors and million-dollar paintings. But then he remembered Grace asking if he was coming back. He remembered Charlotte standing like a shield in front of her sisters. He remembered Amelia saying nothing at all because silence had become safer than speaking. Elijah folded the letter carefully and slipped it inside his work jacket. Just then the basement door opened again. Vanessa descended halfway down the stairs, breathing unevenly now, composure finally cracking around the edges. Her eyes landed immediately on the opened envelope in Elijah's hands. For one brief second, panic crossed her face before she buried it beneath practiced control. Where did you get that? She asked quietly. Elijah answered honestly. Under the workbench. Vanessa stared at him a long moment. Then at the letter. Then at the key partly visible between his fingers. And when she finally spoke again, her voice sounded nothing like the polished woman from upstairs. It sounded tired. You were never supposed to find that. Vanessa descended the rest of the basement stairs slowly, one hand tightening around the railing as if she suddenly needed help standing upright. The polished confidence she carried upstairs had faded beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Down here, beside old pipes and concrete walls, she looked less like a Sinclair executive and more like a younger sister trying not to drown in responsibilities she never asked for. Elijah slipped the letter carefully back into the envelope. I did not mean to pry, he said quietly. Vanessa gave a tired shake of her head. You are not the problem. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word before she steadied it again. Somewhere above them, another door slammed shut. The mansion had become a house full of negotiations disguised as grief. Vanessa stepped closer and lowered her voice. Eleanor wrote letters when she got scared. Elijah frowned faintly. Scared of what? Vanessa let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, except there was no humor in it. Of dying before she figured out who around her actually loved those girls. Silence settled between them after that. Elijah looked toward the basement ceiling again. The sisters were somewhere up there surrounded by adults discussing futures like business transactions. He had seen enough custody battles in his neighborhood growing up to recognize the sound. Children became paperwork faster than anyone admitted. Vanessa noticed the way his expression changed. "You have a son, do not you?" she asked suddenly. Elijah blinked once, surprised. "Isaiah. How old?" "7. Vanessa nodded quietly to herself. "That explains it." Elijah did not ask what she meant. Partly because he already knew. Parents recognized certain things in each other. Exhaustion. Vigilance. The habit of listening for children even in silence. Vanessa glanced toward the envelope in his hands again. "Eleanor trusted instincts more than resumes," she said softly. "Drove everyone around her crazy." A faint smile touched her lips for the first time all day before disappearing just as quickly. She noticed people others overlooked. Elijah looked down at the brass key in his palm. "Why me?" Vanessa's eyes lifted toward him fully now. For the first time since they met, she stopped looking at the oil stains on his jacket or the worn edges of his boots. She looked directly at him. "Because when Grace panicked during the school storm last year, you sat on the gym floor beside her for 2 hours after your shift ended." Elijah stared back at her quietly. He barely remembered doing it. The little girl had been frightened. That was all. Vanessa continued. "You never asked who she was. You never treated her differently once you found out." Her expression tightened slightly. "Most people in this town do." Elijah lowered his gaze after that. Men like him learned early that kindness could be mistaken for strategy whenever rich people were involved. He had spent enough years being watched carefully in stores, offices, and waiting rooms to understand how quickly assumptions formed. Upstairs, another sharp burst of voices echoed through the vents. Then came Charlotte's voice. "Angry now. You cannot split us up." Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. Just for a second. But Elijah saw it. The fear beneath all her composure. When she opened them again, she looked older somehow. "The board wants stability before next quarter," she admitted quietly. "The relatives want control of trust accounts." Elijah frowned. "And the girls?" Vanessa's silence answered first. That silence told him everything. A cold feeling settled in his chest. Because suddenly the letter in his jacket no longer felt strange. It felt intentional. Upstairs, footsteps moved quickly across the hallway. Then Amelia's quiet crying drifted faintly through the floorboards. Elijah looked toward the stairs instinctively before he could stop himself. Vanessa noticed. Something in her expression softened at that. Not attraction. Not pity. Recognition. Like she was finally seeing the difference between a man who noticed children and a world full of adults too distracted to care. Then she reached into the pocket of her ivory coat and pulled out a folded legal document. Her manicured fingers tightened slightly around the edges before she handed it toward him. Elijah hesitated before taking it. At the top, beneath the Sinclair family letterhead, was a single sentence highlighted in pale yellow. Temporary guardianship candidates under review. Elijah's eyes moved slowly down the page. Wealthy relatives. Corporate trustees. Private institutions. Names with influence. Power. Status. His own name sat handwritten at the very bottom in Eleanor Sinclair's elegant script. And beside it were 6 words that made his pulse stop cold. The only one the girls trust. Elijah read the sentence 3 times before the meaning fully settled into his chest. The only one the girls trust. His thumb remained pressed against the edge of the document while the basement furnace hummed steadily beside them. For a moment, neither he nor Vanessa spoke. Somewhere upstairs, silverware clinked faintly against expensive china as guests drifted through a funeral reception nobody truly wanted to attend. Life continuing too quickly after death always felt cruel to Elijah. Vanessa finally broke the silence. The board will never approve it. Her voice sounded calm again, but only on the surface. Underneath it sat exhaustion sharp enough to cut through marble. Elijah handed the document back slowly. Then why show me? Vanessa hesitated before answering. Because Eleanor trusted her instincts. And because, she looked away briefly. I think she knew something I did not. Elijah frowned slightly. About me? Vanessa gave a small nod. About people. That landed harder than she intended. Elijah lowered his eyes toward his work boots again, uncomfortable beneath the weight of words that sounded too close to respect. Men like him were rarely trusted around money. Around rich families. Around grief tied to inheritance. Most days he worked inside luxury homes without anyone remembering his face afterward. He fixed problems quietly while owners discussed vacations 10 feet away like he was part of the wall. Yet somehow a billionaire woman he barely knew had written his name into documents meant to protect her daughters. Upstairs, another burst of voices echoed through the vents. This time louder. Elijah caught only fragments. Temporary placement, board liability, New York campus. Vanessa's jaw tightened immediately. They are already discussing schools. Elijah looked toward the basement stairs. The funeral ended 2 hours ago. To some people, timing is efficiency. Her bitterness slipped out before she could stop it. For the first time all day, Elijah saw the real Vanessa beneath the polished exterior. Not cold. Not cruel. Just trapped inside a world where appearances often mattered more than tenderness. She leaned tiredly against the railing. Charlotte overheard part of the meeting. Elijah already knew what that meant. Children heard everything adults tried to hide. Especially frightened children. She thinks they are separating them, Vanessa admitted softly. And honestly, she paused. She may not be wrong. A heavy silence settled between them. Elijah thought about Isaiah waiting at home, probably doing homework at the kitchen table beside a bowl of cereal because his father had not made it back yet. He thought about how his son still checked the apartment window every evening at exactly 6:15 to watch for the old Ford truck pulling into the parking lot. Stability mattered more than money ever could. Children measured safety in routines adults overlooked. Warm kitchens. Familiar footsteps. Somebody showing up. Elijah rubbed a rough hand across the back of his neck slowly. I am not a lawyer, he said quietly. Or some rich family friend. Vanessa gave a faint humorless smile. That might actually be the point. Before Elijah could answer, hurried footsteps descended from upstairs. Charlotte appeared first, breathing hard, eyes blazing with anger she was trying desperately not to cry through. Amelia followed silently beside her while Grace clutched the stuffed sleeve of Charlotte's black coat. The oldest girl stopped cold when she saw the documents in Vanessa's hand. You lied, Charlotte whispered. Vanessa straightened immediately. Charlotte, listen to me. You said nobody was deciding anything tonight. Charlotte's voice cracked despite her effort to keep it steady. I heard Uncle Richard talking about sending Amelia to Connecticut. Grace's small face crumpled instantly after hearing that. Amelia just stood frozen, too overwhelmed even to react. Elijah felt something twist painfully in his chest watching them. Vanessa moved toward the girls carefully. Nothing has been finalized. But Charlotte stepped back at once. That is what adults say right before they ruin everything. The words hit the basement harder than shouting would have. Grace started crying quietly after that, tiny shoulders trembling against the backpack she still carried. Amelia wrapped an arm around her sister automatically while staring at the floor. Vanessa looked completely helpless for the first time all night. And then something unexpected happened. Grace turned away from every adult in the room and reached instead for Elijah's work jacket with small shaking fingers. Just like she had near the staircase earlier. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The child had already made her choice. For a few seconds, nobody in the basement moved. Grace's small fingers remained curled tightly around the sleeve of Elijah's faded work jacket while her quiet crying echoed softly against the concrete walls. The furnace hummed beside them, pushing warmth into the mansion above, but down there the air still felt cold in a way heat could not fix. Elijah looked down at the little girl carefully. He had seen children reach for comfort before. Usually in grocery stores. School hallways. Emergency rooms. Places where fear made kids instinctively search for the calmest person in the room. But this felt different. This child barely knew him. And somehow she trusted him more than the people carrying her family's last name. Vanessa noticed it too. Elijah could see the realization settle slowly across her face. Not jealousy. Not resentment. Something sadder than that. Acceptance. Charlotte stood stiff beside her sisters, jaw clenched hard enough to shake. She looked embarrassed by Grace's attachment to the maintenance worker, but not surprised. That was the part that mattered. Somewhere deep down, Charlotte already understood why her youngest sister kept gravitating toward him. Elijah crouched slowly to Grace's level. "Hey," he said softly. "Look at me." Grace wiped at her face with her sleeve but obeyed. Elijah kept his voice calm and steady, the same voice he used with Isaiah during thunderstorms. "Nobody is taking your sisters tonight." Charlotte immediately looked toward Vanessa for confirmation. Vanessa hesitated only half a second before nodding firmly. "No," she said. "Not tonight." It was not a full promise. Everybody in the room knew that. But it was enough to loosen some of the panic wrapped around Grace's tiny shoulders. Amelia quietly exhaled beside her sister. Elijah stood again slowly, old knees stiff from years crawling beneath houses and boiler systems. "You girls should eat something," he said gently. "Long day feels longer on an empty stomach." Charlotte almost argued automatically. Elijah saw it happen behind her eyes. But then Grace nodded weakly against the backpack and Amelia whispered, "I am hungry." Just like that, Charlotte's resistance cracked slightly beneath the weight of being the oldest. Vanessa stepped forward carefully. "The kitchen staff made soup earlier." Charlotte looked suspicious immediately. "For us?" Vanessa swallowed. "Yes." The girl did not fully believe her. But she nodded once anyway. Elijah watched the sisters climb the basement stairs slowly together. Grace glanced back twice before disappearing through the doorway. Amelia offered a tiny uncertain wave. Charlotte said nothing at all. But at the top of the stairs, she paused briefly and looked down at Elijah with guarded blue eyes. He recognized the expression instantly. She was measuring him. Deciding whether he was another adult who would eventually disappoint them. He did not blame her for that. Once the girls disappeared upstairs, silence returned to the basement again. Vanessa remained near the railing, visibly drained now that the children were gone. She rubbed lightly beneath one eye before catching herself and straightening her posture again. Years of wealth trained people to hide exhaustion elegantly. Elijah picked up his toolbox slowly. "I should get home," he said. Vanessa nodded distractedly at first. Then suddenly looked at him again. "Would you?" She stopped herself. Elijah waited quietly. Vanessa looked toward the basement stairs before continuing in a softer voice. "Would you consider coming back tomorrow?" Elijah frowned slightly. "To fix something?" A sad almost smile touched her lips. "Probably several things." He understood what she meant immediately. Not pipes. Not boilers. The house itself felt like it was splitting apart around those girls. Elijah shifted the heavy toolbox in his hand. I work mornings across town. Vanessa nodded quickly. I would pay you for your time. The moment the words left her mouth, regret flashed across her face. She realized too late how it sounded. Like kindness could be scheduled by invoice. Elijah noticed the embarrassment settle over her polished features. But he did not make her suffer through it. I know, he said gently. That somehow made it worse. Vanessa looked away first. Upstairs, soft piano music drifted faintly through the vents again. Slow. Lonely. Elijah headed toward the stairs, boots heavy against the concrete steps. But halfway up, he stopped. Something near the basement doorway caught his eye. A tiny silver bracelet resting on the floor. One of Grace's. Elijah bent down carefully and picked it up. 3 engraved initials shimmered beneath the fluorescent light. C.S.A.S.G.S. Charlotte. Amelia. Grace. 3 names linked together forever in silver. Elijah stared at the bracelet quietly for a long moment before slipping it carefully into his jacket pocket. Because somehow, deep down, he already knew this would not be the last time those girls needed him. The drive home felt longer than usual. Rain tapped softly against Elijah's windshield while the old Ford pickup rattled through dark county roads lined with sleeping houses and bare winter trees. The Sinclair mansion disappeared behind him mile by mile, but the weight of that basement stayed in the truck beside him like another passenger. The envelope rested inside his jacket pocket. So did the tiny silver bracelet. Elijah kept one hand steady on the wheel while city lights blurred faintly through the rain ahead. He had spent most of his life avoiding other people's family problems. Especially wealthy ones. Men who looked like him learned early that getting too close to rich people's grief often ended badly. Yet somehow those girls had already followed him home in his thoughts. By the time he pulled into the apartment complex, the clock on the dashboard read 9:43 p.m. Half the parking lot lights were burned out again. Elijah sighed quietly and grabbed his toolbox from the passenger seat before climbing the stairs to the second floor. The hallway smelled faintly of fried onions and old carpet cleaner. Familiar. Real. Nothing polished about it. He unlocked the apartment door carefully, trying not to wake Isaiah if the boy had fallen asleep on the couch again. But the moment the door creaked open, small footsteps rushed across the floor. Dad! Isaiah nearly collided into him wearing mismatched socks and an oversized science camp shirt. Elijah smiled immediately despite the exhaustion dragging at his shoulders. You still awake? Isaiah shrugged. Miss Loretta let me stay until you got home. Elijah glanced toward the kitchen where their elderly neighbor sat drinking tea beneath the yellow stove light. Boy needed somebody to make sure he ate something besides cereal, she muttered. Elijah nodded gratefully. I appreciate you. Miss Loretta waved him off. You work too hard to be thanking anybody. Isaiah grabbed the toolbox from his father before Elijah could stop him. Heavy, the boy grunted dramatically. Elijah chuckled softly for the first time all day. That is because tools are not made of marshmallows. The apartment felt warm. Small. Safe. A pot of soup still sat on the stove covered with foil. Isaiah's homework papers spread across the kitchen table beside broken crayons and a plastic dinosaur. Ordinary things. Elijah suddenly realized how quiet his life usually was compared to the chaos inside the Sinclair mansion. Isaiah kept talking while Elijah washed grease from his hands at the sink. School stories. Spelling test complaints. A debate about whether octopuses counted as aliens. Elijah listened carefully to every word. Because fathers who worked long hours learned the importance of listening when children finally opened up. Then Isaiah noticed the bracelet sliding partly from Elijah's jacket pocket. What is that? Elijah looked down before carefully pulling it free. The silver initials caught the kitchen light softly. Isaiah's eyes widened. Fancy. Elijah sat slowly at the table, turning the bracelet gently between rough fingers. Belongs to somebody. The rich house. Elijah nodded once. Isaiah leaned against the table curiously. Did they get their heat fixed? Elijah thought about Grace crying quietly in the basement. Charlotte trying to act older than 12. Amelia shrinking into silence every time adults argued nearby. Yeah, he answered softly after a moment. Heat came back on. But somehow the answer did not feel true enough. Miss Loretta watched him from the stove with knowing eyes older than wisdom itself. Something else happened there, she said quietly. Elijah did not answer immediately. He rarely talked about work. Especially not the emotional parts of it. But tonight felt different. Isaiah noticed too. The boy climbed into the chair beside him and rested his chin on folded arms. Are the girls okay? Elijah stared at the bracelet again. 3 initials linked together forever in silver. C.S.A.S.G.S. He thought about the legal documents. The hidden lake house key. The sentence Eleanor Sinclair left behind. The only one the girls trust. I do not know, he admitted honestly. Silence settled around the little apartment after that. Soft heater hum. Rain against windows. Soup cooling slowly on the stove. Then Isaiah reached toward the bracelet gently. You should give it back tomorrow, he said. Elijah looked at his son. Probably. Isaiah nodded seriously. Sometimes kids get scared when they lose stuff after somebody dies. The words hit Elijah harder than the boy realized. Because Isaiah was not talking about jewelry. He was talking about people. And deep down, Elijah suddenly understood something that made sleep impossible that night. Those girls were not just afraid of losing a bracelet. They were afraid of losing each other. Elijah barely slept. Long after Isaiah drifted off beneath his faded astronaut blanket, Elijah remained awake at the kitchen table with cold coffee sitting untouched beside him. Rain slid softly down the apartment window while the silver bracelet rested near his rough hands beneath the dim stove light. Every few minutes he looked toward the hallway leading to Isaiah's room, listening for movement out of habit more than necessity. Parents never fully stopped listening. Especially single parents. Around 2 in the morning, Elijah finally unfolded Eleanor Sinclair's letter again. The paper had already softened slightly from being handled too much. He reread certain lines slower this time. Quiet kindness. Steady men. The ones who fix things without needing applause afterward. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes briefly. Nobody had ever written about him that way before. By sunrise, the rain had stopped but heavy clouds still hung low over Ashbury County. Elijah stood at the stove flipping pancakes while Isaiah packed his backpack for school. The little apartment smelled like butter and cheap coffee. Familiar smells. Honest ones. Isaiah glanced toward the bracelet beside the sink again. You are really going back there? Elijah slid another pancake onto the plate. Need to return something. Isaiah nodded slowly like he already knew there was more to it than that. Children notice things adults thought they hid well. Dad? Elijah looked up. Yeah. Isaiah hesitated. If those girls are scared, maybe you should not leave too fast this time. Elijah stared quietly at his son for a second after that. Sometimes children said simple things that landed heavier than grown men's speeches. By late morning, the Sinclair mansion looked even colder than the day before. Funeral flowers still lined the entrance, some already beginning to wilt around the edges despite their price tags. Elijah parked the old Ford near the service entrance again, toolbox rattling softly in the truck bed. Before he could step out fully, he noticed 2 luxury sedans pulling away from the front driveway. Men in suits. Lawyers probably. The kind who left carrying folders instead of grief. Inside, the mansion had changed overnight. The warmth from the repaired furnace filled the hallways now, but the atmosphere felt tighter somehow. Staff members avoided eye contact. Conversation stopped when footsteps approached. Elijah recognized tension immediately. Houses under pressure always sounded different. He had heard it before in apartments before evictions. In homes after divorces. Silence became careful. Measured. He barely made it halfway down the main hallway before small footsteps raced toward him. Grace nearly crashed into his legs before stopping herself at the last second. Relief flooded her face the moment she saw him. "You came back." Elijah crouched carefully and held out the silver bracelet. "Think this belongs to you." Grace gasped softly before grabbing it with both hands. "Charlotte said it was gone forever." Elijah smiled faintly. "Not forever." Grace immediately slipped the bracelet back onto her wrist, then looked around the hallway nervously before lowering her voice. "Charlotte is mad." Elijah nodded slowly. "At me?" Grace shook her head. "At everybody." That did not surprise him. Upstairs, a door slammed somewhere distant. Then came raised voices muffled through walls. Grace flinched instantly at the sound. Elijah noticed. So did Vanessa, who appeared at the far end of the hallway moments later wearing another immaculate cream-colored outfit that could not fully hide the exhaustion beneath her eyes. She slowed when she saw Elijah standing there beside Grace. Something about the image visibly softened her expression. "You came," she said quietly. Elijah stood again. "Needed to return this." Grace held up the bracelet proudly. Vanessa smiled faintly at that before her attention shifted toward the second floor where voices continued rising. Her face tightened immediately. "Charlotte locked herself in Eleanor's office an hour ago," she admitted. "Nobody can get her out." Grace lowered her eyes after hearing that. "She thinks they are going to send us away today." Elijah looked toward the staircase instinctively. The mansion suddenly felt too large for children carrying that kind of fear. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly against herself. "She will not speak to anyone." Then, after a small pause, Vanessa looked directly at Elijah in a way she had not before. Not like maintenance staff. Not like an outsider. More like somebody standing near the edge of a decision she did not fully understand yet. "But she might speak to you." Elijah frowned immediately. "I barely know her." Vanessa's expression softened sadly. "That may actually be why." Before Elijah could answer, another sharp crash echoed from upstairs. Not violent. Just something thrown against a wall in frustration. Grace grabbed Elijah's sleeve again automatically. And somewhere above them, Charlotte Sinclair finally shouted words loud enough for the entire mansion to hear. "I am not letting strangers decide my family." The mansion fell silent after Charlotte's voice echoed through the second floor. Even the staff members near the dining hall froze for a moment, pretending not to hear what everyone had already been thinking since Eleanor Sinclair died. Elijah stood near the staircase with Grace pressed quietly against his side while Vanessa looked upward with tired eyes that no amount of expensive makeup could fully hide anymore. Somewhere above them, a door slammed again. Then silence. Heavy silence. The kind that usually came right before somebody broke down crying. Vanessa rubbed her forehead slowly. "She has been in there since breakfast." Elijah glanced toward the staircase. "Nobody checked on her." Vanessa gave him a look that carried equal parts frustration and embarrassment. 3 attorneys tried. Uncle Richard tried. 1 therapist tried. Her voice tightened slightly. Charlotte told all of them to leave. Grace looked down at the floor and whispered, "She only talks when she feels safe." Elijah heard it. So did Vanessa. That small sentence seemed to settle heavily between them. Elijah hesitated for a second before setting his toolbox carefully beside the staircase. "I can try," he said quietly. Vanessa blinked once, visibly surprised he offered at all. "You do not have to." "I know." That answer affected her more than she expected. Elijah started up the staircase slowly, old wooden steps creaking beneath his work boots while voices drifted faintly from distant rooms below. The Sinclair mansion looked different during daylight. Less elegant. More tired. Sunlight filtered weakly through tall windows, exposing dust no one noticed during parties and business dinners. Wealth always looked softer in dim lighting. At the top of the stairs, Elijah followed the hallway toward the office at the far end. Eleanor Sinclair's office. The double doors remained shut tight. One crystal picture frame lay broken outside against the wall where it had apparently been thrown earlier. Elijah stopped a few feet from the door. He did not knock immediately. Instead, he listened. Nothing. No movement. No crying. That worried him more. Finally, he spoke gently through the door. "Charlotte?" Silence answered. Elijah kept his voice calm. "It is Elijah. The furnace guy." A pause. Then a sharp response from inside. "Go away." Elijah nodded slightly to himself. At least she answered. "Okay," he said simply. "I just wanted to make sure you were not hungry." Another silence followed. Longer this time. Elijah leaned lightly against the hallway wall beside the office. "My son locks himself in the bathroom sometimes when he gets upset," he said casually. "Usually after math homework." Nothing. Then finally came a muffled voice. "I am not a child." Elijah looked toward the closed door quietly. "No," he agreed softly. "That is probably part of the problem." Silence again. But this time it felt different. Listening silence. Elijah noticed small things after years of being a father alone. The difference between anger and loneliness. Between shouting and wanting somebody to stay anyway. He slid slowly down the wall until he sat on the hallway floor outside the office like a man waiting at a bus stop. No pressure. No speeches. Just presence. Downstairs, Vanessa appeared quietly near the staircase but Elijah gave the smallest shake of his head without looking directly at her. Not yet. She understood immediately and stayed back. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Elijah remained seated calmly on the hardwood floor, arms resting loosely across his knees while sunlight stretched slowly across the hallway carpet. Finally, the office door clicked softly. Only a few inches. Charlotte stood there with red eyes and stiff shoulders trying hard not to look 12 years old. She stared down at Elijah sitting outside the door in silence. "Why are you still here?" Elijah shrugged lightly. "Told you my son does this too." Charlotte crossed her arms immediately. Defensive. "I do not need help." "Probably not." She frowned at that answer. Adults usually argued with her. Corrected her. Tried controlling her emotions. Elijah just sat there calmly like somebody who understood storms eventually passed on their own. Charlotte studied him carefully. His worn jacket. Grease stains near his sleeve. The roughness in his hands. Nothing about him belonged in the Sinclair mansion. Yet somehow he felt more real than everyone else inside it. "They are trying to split us up," she whispered finally. There it was. The real fear underneath all the anger. Elijah looked at her quietly for a long moment before answering. "You know what my son hates most?" Charlotte shook her head slightly despite herself. "When adults make decisions without explaining anything first." Something inside her expression cracked at that. Just a little. Then her eyes drifted downward toward Elijah's jacket pocket where the corner of Eleanor's envelope accidentally showed beneath the fabric. Charlotte froze instantly. Her breathing changed. "Why do you have my mother's handwriting?" Elijah instinctively placed a hand over his jacket pocket the moment Charlotte noticed the envelope. Not to hide it from her. Just surprise. Charlotte's eyes sharpened immediately, every protective instinct inside her waking up at once. She pushed the office door open wider and stepped into the hallway fully now, arms still crossed tight against herself like armor. "Where did you get it?" she demanded quietly. Elijah stood slowly from the floor, careful not to crowd her space. "Your aunt did not tell you." Charlotte's jaw tightened. "Nobody tells me anything anymore." The honesty in her voice landed harder than anger would have. Elijah understood that feeling too well. Adults often mistook silence for protection when really it just made children feel invisible. He pulled the envelope carefully from his pocket and handed it toward her without hesitation. Charlotte looked shocked he gave it up so easily. For a second she just stared at the familiar handwriting on the cream-colored paper. Then her fingers trembled slightly as she took it. "This is her real writing," she whispered. "Not polished signatures from magazines or company documents. Personal handwriting. The kind children memorized without realizing it." Charlotte looked down at the envelope for a long moment before slowly opening the office door wider. "Come in," she said quietly. Elijah hesitated. "You sure?" Charlotte gave the smallest shrug. "You already know too much anyway." The office smelled faintly like expensive perfume and old books. Soft daylight filtered through enormous windows overlooking the frozen lake behind the estate. Eleanor Sinclair's desk remained untouched exactly as she left it. A coffee cup still sat near scattered papers. One high heel rested beside the couch like she had kicked it off during a long night of work and never came back for it. The room felt painfully alive for somebody who was gone. Charlotte moved toward the desk slowly while Elijah stayed near the doorway, respectful of the space. "Mom wrote letters when she got scared," Charlotte said softly without looking at him. "After Amelia got sick once, after Grace got lost at the airport," she swallowed hard. "She always wrote things down in case something happened." Elijah watched her carefully. The girl looked so much older inside this office. Like grief had forced adulthood onto her overnight. Charlotte unfolded the letter with cautious hands. Elijah immediately looked away toward the windows, giving her privacy without announcing it. Another small thing Eleanor Sinclair apparently understood about him before they ever truly met. Silence filled the office except for the distant sound of voices downstairs and wind brushing lightly against the glass outside. Then Elijah heard it. Not crying exactly. More like breathing suddenly becoming difficult. He glanced back carefully. Charlotte stood frozen beside the desk, staring at the letter while tears slipped silently down her face despite every effort to stop them. Elijah did not move closer. He simply stayed there quietly. Present. Safe. Charlotte wiped at her cheeks angrily before speaking. "She knew," she whispered. "She knew they would try to separate us." Elijah said nothing. Charlotte looked up at him then, really looked at him for the first time. Not as maintenance staff. Not as an outsider wandering accidentally into their family tragedy. She looked at him like somebody trying to understand why her mother trusted a man she barely knew. "Why would she write your name?" Elijah leaned lightly against the doorway. "I asked the same thing." Charlotte stared at him another long moment before lowering her eyes toward the letter again. "Because you stayed during the storm," she said quietly. Elijah blinked once. Charlotte gave a weak humorless laugh through tears. "Grace talked about you for weeks afterward." That surprised him more than it should have. Charlotte folded the letter carefully against her chest before walking toward the bookshelf beside Eleanor's desk. She crouched near the bottom cabinet and pulled open a drawer Elijah would never have noticed on his own. Inside sat dozens of neatly stacked envelopes tied together with pale ribbon. Letters. For birthdays. Graduations. Emergencies. Eleanor Sinclair had prepared love in advance because deep down she knew time was running out. Charlotte touched the ribbons gently. "She was trying to protect us even after," her voice broke before finishing. Elijah looked away again, giving dignity to her grief the only way he knew how. Through quietness. Then Charlotte suddenly asked something unexpected. Do you think a person can belong somewhere they were never supposed to? Elijah frowned slightly. What do you mean? Charlotte looked toward him carefully now. You do not fit in this house. Honest. Direct. Childishly brutal. But not cruel. Elijah nodded once. Probably not. Charlotte glanced down at the letter in her hands. Neither do we anymore. And somehow, hearing a billionaire's daughter say that inside a mansion worth millions made Elijah's chest ache in a way he could not fully explain. Charlotte's words stayed in the room long after she said them. Neither do we anymore. Elijah stood quietly near the office doorway while winter light stretched across the hardwood floor between them. Somewhere downstairs, expensive dishes clinked softly as staff prepared lunch nobody upstairs planned to eat. The mansion still looked perfect from the outside. But inside, grief had already started rearranging everything. Charlotte carefully retied the ribbon around the stack of letters and slid them back into the drawer one by one. Her movements were controlled, almost ritualistic, like touching her mother's things too quickly might make the loss feel more real. Elijah noticed how often children tried holding themselves together through small routines after tragedy. Fold the blanket. Tie the ribbon. Put the cup back exactly where it was. Tiny acts against chaos. Grace thinks you are safe, Charlotte said suddenly without looking at him. Elijah leaned lightly against the wall. Grace does not know me. She knows enough. Charlotte closed the drawer slowly. Kids can tell. Elijah thought about Isaiah saying almost the exact same thing at breakfast. Funny how children recognized character faster than adults with college degrees and legal teams. Charlotte finally looked toward him again, eyes still red but steadier now. Everybody else in this house talks like we are problems to solve. Elijah frowned slightly. And me? Charlotte hesitated. You listen first. The simplicity of that answer hit harder than compliments ever could. Before Elijah could respond, a knock sounded softly at the office door. Vanessa stepped inside carrying a silver tray with untouched soup bowls balanced carefully in manicured hands. She stopped briefly when she saw Charlotte standing beside Elijah instead of barricaded behind the door. Relief flickered across her face too quickly to hide. I brought food, she said gently. Charlotte crossed her arms automatically. I am not hungry. Vanessa almost argued by instinct. Elijah saw it happen. The impulse adults had to fix emotions immediately instead of sitting beside them a while. But Vanessa caught herself this time. Slowly, she set the tray down on Eleanor's desk instead. Okay, she said quietly. Charlotte blinked once, surprised by the lack of pressure. Vanessa glanced subtly toward Elijah afterward, understanding exactly where that shift came from. The office settled into silence again. 3 people standing inside the life Eleanor Sinclair left behind. The wealthy white executive trying desperately to hold her sister's world together. The guarded little girl carrying too much fear too young. And the black single father with grease beneath his fingernails somehow becoming the calmest thing inside the mansion. Then footsteps approached rapidly down the hallway. Heavy. Confident. The kind that expected doors to open automatically. Vanessa stiffened instantly. Charlotte's face hardened again. A tall gray-haired man entered without knocking. Richard Sinclair. Expensive navy coat. Silver cufflinks. The polished impatience of somebody accustomed to controlling rooms through sheer status alone. His eyes landed on Elijah first and paused noticeably too long on the work jacket and worn boots. Maintenance should use the back staircase, he said flatly. Charlotte immediately stepped closer to Elijah without realizing she had done it. Richard noticed. So did Vanessa. The older man's expression tightened slightly. The board meeting starts in 20 minutes, he continued toward Vanessa. We need signatures finalized before markets close tomorrow. Charlotte spoke before Vanessa could answer. You are talking about us like stock options again. Richard exhaled slowly through his nose. Charlotte, emotions are high right now. That is what adults say when they want children quiet. The sharpness in her voice stunned even Vanessa. Richard's attention shifted toward Elijah again. And who exactly is this? Vanessa answered carefully. This is Elijah Carter. Richard waited for more. A title. Credentials. Social standing. None came. His eyes narrowed slightly. The repairman? Elijah stayed calm beneath the scrutiny. Furnace needed fixing. Richard gave a short humorless nod before turning back toward Vanessa. We already have enough confusion without involving outsiders. The sentence hung heavily in the room. Outsiders. Elijah had heard versions of that word his entire life. Sometimes politely. Sometimes not. But always clearly enough. Charlotte looked between the two men silently. One dressed in wealth and authority. The other carrying a dented toolbox and quiet dignity. Then she made a decision nobody in the room expected. She walked directly to Elijah's side and stood there deliberately. He is not an outsider, she said quietly. Richard frowned immediately. Charlotte. But the girl lifted her chin stubbornly through lingering tears. He stayed. Silence swallowed the office after that. Because deep down, everyone in the room understood exactly what she meant. Richard Sinclair stared at Charlotte for several long seconds after she spoke. The office suddenly felt smaller somehow. Tighter. Sunlight from the tall windows cut across the hardwood floor while nobody moved. Elijah remained still near the doorway with his hands relaxed at his sides, refusing to let the tension in the room pull him into a fight that was never truly about him. Charlotte stood beside him stubbornly, chin lifted despite tears still drying against her cheeks. He stayed. Such simple words. Yet they landed harder than every polished speech delivered downstairs since Eleanor Sinclair died. Richard adjusted the cuff of his expensive coat slowly, visibly irritated by the shift happening in the room. Charlotte, he said carefully, the way wealthy men spoke when trying to sound reasonable while already deciding outcomes privately. You are emotional right now. Charlotte laughed once under her breath. Not amused. Hurt. Everybody keeps saying that whenever I tell the truth. Vanessa looked away briefly after hearing it. Because she knew Charlotte was right. Richard's attention moved back toward Elijah again. Measuring. Judging. Searching for motive. Men like Richard spent their entire lives believing everyone wanted something. Money. Access. Advantage. Quiet kindness confused people like that. Elijah had learned it years ago. Mr. Carter, Richard said coolly, I appreciate the work you have done here, but this is a family matter. Elijah nodded once. I figured. He bent calmly to pick up his toolbox from beside the doorway. No argument. No wounded pride. Just dignity. That unsettled Richard more than resistance would have. Before Elijah could leave, Grace suddenly appeared in the hallway clutching Amelia's hand tightly. The two younger girls must have heard raised voices downstairs and followed the sound. Grace looked immediately toward Charlotte, then toward Elijah. Are you leaving? She asked softly. The question changed the room again. Elijah saw Vanessa close her eyes briefly beside the desk. Richard exhaled impatiently through his nose. But Charlotte answered first. Everybody keeps leaving. Grace's face crumpled slightly after hearing that. Amelia moved closer beside her sisters without speaking. Elijah looked at the three girls standing together in the middle of that giant office. 3 children surrounded by wealth, lawyers, board members, and family connections, yet somehow still alone. Something inside him shifted quietly then. Not dramatic. Not heroic. Just clear. The kind of clarity fathers sometimes felt without warning. Like instinct arriving before logic caught up. He set the toolbox back down. Richard noticed immediately. "You are still here," the older man said flatly. Elijah met his eyes calmly for the first time. "Seems like they need somebody to stay a little longer." Silence followed. Vanessa looked toward him slowly, something unreadable moving through her guarded expression. Respect maybe. Relief too. Richard looked openly unconvinced. "And what exactly do you think you can offer these girls?" It was not shouted. That almost made it worse. Elijah glanced toward the sisters before answering. "Stability matters to kids." Richard gave a faint humorless smile. "You think stability comes from a maintenance salary and a two-bedroom apartment?" There it was. The thing underneath everything else. Status. Class. The unspoken belief that dignity only counted when attached to money. Vanessa immediately looked uncomfortable, but Elijah remained calm. He had heard worse. Much worse. "No," Elijah said quietly. "I think stability comes from people showing up when they say they will." The office went still after that. Because everybody in the room knew Eleanor Sinclair's world had been filled with people who promised things and disappeared the moment grief became inconvenient. Grace slowly walked toward Elijah then. Small steps across polished hardwood floors. She reached for his rough hand without hesitation. Amelia followed beside her. Charlotte stayed where she was longest, pride fighting visibly against hope inside her chest. But finally, even she moved closer too. Three sisters standing near the black single father with grease still beneath his fingernails while million-dollar paintings watched silently from the walls. Vanessa looked at them for a long moment before speaking quietly toward Richard. "Maybe Eleanor understood something we did not." Richard said nothing. He simply stared at the children clustered instinctively around a man none of them were supposed to trust this much. Then, from somewhere deep inside the mansion, the repaired furnace kicked on again with a low steady hum. Warm air slowly filled the office while winter pressed uselessly against the windows outside.